Welcome to Nerds at Church, a podcast about nerdery and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
And I'm Rabbi Becky Silverstein, and my pronouns are he, him, his.
In this episode, we'll discuss the Easter Vigil. Dun, dun, dun. We have been building to this point for 3 years, which this year falls on April 8th, or the 9th if you do it at sunrise / after midnight, like all the cool kids.
Check out the episode description for links to the Bible passages and other references we make in this episode.
So, for this episode, we are super excited, not only because we are doing the Easter Vigil, but even more so because we are doing a deep dive into Midrash, which is a Jewish practice, and we are super excited to have special guest Rabbi Becky Silverstein, who believes in the power of community, Torah, and silliness in transforming the world. He strives to build a Jewish community and world that encourages and allows everyone to live a life that reflects their inherent divinity and dignity. Becky is on the faculty at Sfara, a traditionally radical yeshiva, and co-founder of the Trans Halacha Project. Welcome!
Thanks.
We are so glad you're
I'm so glad to be here. Yeah, thanks. What fun.
Mm-hmm. We are excited, for sure. So, Becky, we have other questions. But first off, can you tell us just a little bit about Sfara and the Trans Halacha Project?
Yeah, and A plus pronunciation there of halacha. That was excellent, Emily.
Yes.
Yeah, really, really good. Sfara is a yeshiva for queer and trans folks. A yeshiva is a place of Jewish learning. And we bring queer and trans folks together these days, mostly or maybe even exclusively online, to learn Talmud and to build our skills as readers of the Jewish tradition, so that we can be players in that tradition, as our teacher and founder, B'nai Lappi, would say, so that we can help shape the tradition as it moves forward. And the Trans Halacha Project is an extension of that. Halacha literally means walking or the path or the way we move through the world. And it is also what we call Jewish law. And so the Trans Halacha Project strives to create Jewish law by trans people for trans people. And I'm glad you asked. Yesterday was our siyum, our closing day of learning, where we shared 15 questions and answers, halachic responsa, that were written by trans folks, and a collection of blessings and rituals written by and for trans experience too. So like a blessing for meeting a new queer or trans friend, an intention to say before going out in public as trans, things for name changes. Anyway, it's all there and it's very exciting. So thanks for the question.
That is amazing. And I mean, particularly in this time in this country, right?
Absolutely.
Like, that is so amazing. But also we did for Transfiguration, which is the last Sunday before the season of Lent, which is the season we're in right now. As we record, we did a panel of trans folks. And so this just feels like a wonderful kind of
fun.
Bookend of Lent.
Yes.
To have like...
Everybody should bookend their religious experiences with trans folks.
Exactly. And, you know, have them throughout because...
Absolutely, that too.
But yeah, that's just beautiful. I'm excited.
Yeah.
And that's findable. We're gonna Perfect. So we will link to that in the episode description for our listeners to be able to look up those wonderful blessings. And
speaking of people our listeners may already be familiar with, I know Rabbi Danya Rutenberg was cheerleading this from Twitter for the last couple of weeks. So it was great to hear that you were involved in it too. Yeah.
That's right. Danya is our number one cheerleader, my number one personal cheerleader these days in the professional world. So yeah.
So many of our listeners are probably unfamiliar with Midrash. I imagine some of them know what it is. Can you give us kind of a brief summary of what Midrash is?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. What is Midrash? Midrash is a Hebrew word, first of all, and it comes from the root. This is a Sfara thing where we like to start with the root of words and see what the roots mean and then extrapolate from them into contexts. So the root of the word Midrash is Dalid Resh Shin, which means to expound or and interpret, to examine or question. And so Midrash is the mem there, the first letter of that Hebrew word makes a noun. And it is the category or the word given to the category of work that is supplementary to the Tanakh, So Tanakh, the Torah, Nevi'im, prophets, and Ketuvim, writings that make up the Hebrew Bible, right? So Midrash are pieces of text that widen or deepen the scope of those original texts. So take a verse and go deeper or wider on that verse. And we'll get to lots of examples as we go. And just to say, Midrash, I wouldn't say it's been around necessarily since the time of Torah or Tanakh, but definitely there's intertextual Midrash, right? So the prophets, right, or writings refer back to moments in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, and that's a sort of intertextual Midrash. But Midrash, it's as like a category outside of the Tanakh, has been around for forever, really, like pretty much since that beginning, maybe just after that beginning, and exists today. Right. So one of my favorite collections of Midrash is a collection called Dirshuni that has come out of the collective work of women scholars and everyday women, learned women in Israel over the past decade, 2 volumes of it, women writing Midrashim.
Ooh,
great.
So
nice.
It kind of sounds like Midrash implies having sort of a friendly and inquisitive and interactive relationship with the text.
Yeah.
So that sounds...
Yeah, I love those adjectives. That's a beautiful characterization. And maybe I'll just say, like, based on those adjectives that bring up for me, that there are 2 categories of Midrash too. One is Midrash Halacha. And Midrash Halacha is the part of Midrash that seeks to clarify law beyond the Tanakh. As I've previously said, Halacha is Jewish law. So for example, what does it mean when we talk about the Shema in Deuteronomy? That you'll bind them as a sign between your eyes, right? How do we get from there to wearing tefillin, which is Hebrew, or phylacteries, the Greek English word for that? I'm not sure which is more useful to anyone, your readers, your listeners, or anybody in the world.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have a lot of pastors who listen, but also a lot of lay people. And
yeah, who knows?
Yeah. Both of them are foreign languages, really.
Totally. So there's Midrash Halacha, and then there's Midrash Agadah. And that is Midrash that is more story-based, let's say.
That's the Midrash that I'm more familiar with as a concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that makes a lot of sense to me. And one of my favorite descriptions of Midrash Agadah on myjewishlearning.com, which is a go-to source for what does Judaism say about this? Yeah. They describe works of Midrash Agadah as occupying the meeting ground between reverence and love for the wording of the fixed text of Torah and theological creativity.
Ooh, wow. Yeah.
Yeah.
And somehow I have to say I'm not terribly surprised that people who love reading the Hebrew scriptures would want to teach by stories. That does seem appropriate somehow.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so then what is the Talmud in relationship to either of those? To either the Tanakh or Midrash.
Yeah, perfect. I think it might be helpful to step back, just zoom out one more step, which is to the idea that Judaism has 2 types of Torahs. Torah shebe'al peh and Torah shebichtav. Actually, I said those in the wrong direction. Torah shebichtav, the written Torah, which refers to Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. And Torah shebe'al peh, the spoken Torah, which is everything that is not that. And so the spoken Torah, which, by the way, we today interact with mostly out of books, but is Midrashim and is the Mishnah and the Talmud and the works of halacha of Jewish law that come after that. Sure. So I would say Midrash is both a word for a set of collections, like Midrash Rabbah, the great Midrash, which has sections on Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy too, all the way through, and Esther and Ruth and blah, 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 right? It's named for that. And in that way, the Talmud is also a collection of work, right? And it's a discursive work based on trying to understand the Mishnah, which is trying to understand how we live Torah. And all of these things are really about understanding how we build worlds based on Torah. But so Midrash can be collections of texts, but also is a technique that's used. So within the Talmud, as they're trying to figure out Jewish law, the rabbis and the editors of the Talmud are trying to figure out Jewish law. There are 5 sources of authority that they use. One is Svara, the name of the yeshiva that I worked for, which is intuition. One is Takana, rabbinic decrees. One is Maaseh, what the people are out there doing. And I'm losing one in my head. Oh, well. But one is Midrash or Kra. and I'm using Midrash as a technique to understand what a verse is saying. And I can share an example of that in a little bit, but basically like, here's a claim we want to make. Here's a verse we think is making that claim, and here's how it's doing that.
Sure.
I feel like I have done that without knowing that that is like what I'm doing, particularly with the first chapter of Genesis and God creating humanity in all of its gendered diversity.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example, right? Genesis, this is like a great example. Genesis 1:27 says, right, Vayivra Elohim et Adam b'tzelmo, b'tzelem Elohim bara oto, zachar nekeva bara otam. So God created humankind in God's image. In the divine image, God created the divine human. Male and female, he created otam, them, right? And so we go from a singular, oto, earlier in the verse, to a plural, otam. And so one example of Midrash on this verse says, oh, actually the first being that God created was an androgynous.
Sure.
And right, why is that? Right, that's the claim the rabbis make. The verse they pick is Genesis 1:27. And then the drash on that verse is that otam, or is that move from oto to otam, right? That this singular oto has to include otam, both male and female, as part of it.
Sure. I love it.
A favorite midrash of many a people.
It's true. Oh, I love this. Okay, before we get, too much into just Emily's random curiosities, we specifically chose Midrash as our deep dive topic for this episode on the Easter Vigil because for Christians, the Easter Vigil is really focused on telling some of the most foundational stories of the faith for Christians found in Hebrew scripture in really creative ways, right? Like there are some congregations that do Easter Vigil and they just read directly from the version that they have. And there are others that will do skits or sing songs or put on plays or right? Some of the stories like Daniel where it's they actually get out the lyre, the harp, the lute, all of the things, and they're and this and this, and to really give a sense of the storytelling and the stories that make up our faith. And part of Midrash, a type of Midrash, is its own wonderfully creative telling and retelling of the stories of faith. So you've kind of answered this, but I guess I'm going to ask it again. And how does and doesn't Midrash fit with Jewish scripture? I'm just going to ask it again because you answered it, but also I feel like there's another.
Yeah. I'm with you. I mean, I'm really drawn with this idea of the telling and retelling that you're framing of foundational stories that you're reframing sort of as the Easter Vigil. Well, that is the Easter Vigil, let's just say. Because I think that, right, what Midrash is, or really what all of Torah Shebe'al Peh, all of oral Torah are the rabbis doing two things. The rabbis and us. I have to stop saying just the rabbis because a project I worked on, as I said at the top, just dropped a whole bunch of oral Torah yesterday.
Yeah.
Right? And I already cited a modern work, right, Dear Shuni. So all of this is an attempt to figure out how to live Torah, which is what I think it means to be Jewish, is to figure out how to authentically live Torah or to embody Torah, and also to build a world, right? The world we live in, the world we want to live in. And part of that is narrative, right? And is the telling, the retelling, the reshaping of foundational narratives in our time. And Midrash is part of that. I think, and I'm going to use an example, right, and maybe I'll just jump, right, I'll just jump to this question of some of my favorite Midrashim, just riffing off of foundational narratives, because y'all are heading into Easter season, and we are in the liminal space between Purim and Passover, and then we'll be in the liminal space of the desert between Passover and Shavuot. But as Passover comes, there's no more foundational story for many of us. We can discuss how much of it is shared or not shared, right? Than the Exodus from Egypt. And so what do Midrashim add to the Exodus from Egypt in a telling and retelling, right? And so you could retell that story, and maybe in parallel, this will be instructive as sort of a frame through which we could look at, you can think about Easter too, right? We could just read Exodus, right? You could sit at the Seder table and read Exodus. You could read Exodus 12 or the surrounding chapters. You could read the early ones and talk about how the Israelites entered slavery or were enslaved, rather.
Sure.
The Haggadah doesn't do that.
Yeah.
Right? The Haggadah doesn't read Exodus. Instead, it presents the rabbi's retelling of the Exodus story. Right. And they use Midrash to do that. And they retell it in such a way that minimizes Moses's role and maybe doesn't maximize God's role, because I think God's role is pretty big in the original text too.
I would hope so.
But yeah, yes. And I think Moses would want us to say that too, right? I think Moses would be like, obviously I shared the stage with the Holy Blessed One here, or was an agent of the Holy Blessed One, but Midrash retells that story. I'm only allowed to buy one new Haggadah a year. That's like the rule. Otherwise,
boundaries.
Pastors, bookshelves, rabbis are there too. But there are lots of different Haggadot that present not only the traditional Haggadah text, which gives the rabbis sharing midrashim, like how many frogs were there, or how do we do the math behind certain verses, that God took us out with an outstretched hand and an outstretched arm. Well, an outstretched hand is 5 fingers. Like, there are midrashim about this in the Haggadah, but then every Haggadah that comes out adds another layer on top of that, of how we understand the story. But my favorite midrash this season, well, is it my favorite? One of my favorite.
That's
always.
Right.
Yes.
Always one of. Yeah.
One of my favorite midrashim this time around, it feels surprisingly resonant in contemporary times, but actually comes from classical midrashim. And I'll just say, like, midrashim, like much of other Jewish texts and like much of other scripture or older, like ancient texts, right, exists in different forms in different places. And so this midrash exists in the Talmud, in Masechet Sota, and it exists in Bereshit Rabbah, the collection of midrashim on Genesis, even though it's about Exodus. And it exists in Midrash Tanchuma, which is another version, another collection of midrashim too. But it says this, at least in Sota, it says that the Israelites, merited redemption through the hands of righteous women. Now, that's a surprisingly feminist statement for a bunch of misogynists. And I don't let's not flatten the rabbis to just being misogynists. They also had a lot of love for Torah and God, and for really, I think, thought they were building a world for many people, even if the reality is they are who they are. But so they make this statement, and then they bring this midrash that says, when the tabernacle was being built, we read towards the end of the book of Exodus that everybody brought donations, right? And that women brought mirrors. And Moses says, what are these mirrors going to be used for? And maybe it's not Moses. Maybe I'm misremembering the midrash.
I don't know. Moses was...
Right.
I believe it was
Moses.
Moses.
Talk a lot, but...
Yeah. And Moses, so whomever says, like, what are you bringing these mirrors for? These signs of vanity. And the midrash says the women would take these midrashim, that the men were out in the field working, and uses midrash as a technique to prove that they were out in the field. And that God provided the women with containers, and they went down to the river, and the containers were filled with fish. And then the women would take these containers filled with fish and these mirrors out into the fields, and they would seduce their husbands. And they would seduce their husbands first by making them a meal, and then by passing the mirror back and forth between themselves and their husbands, saying, I'm prettier than you are. I'm prettier than you are. And they would arouse themselves until they were up for doing the deed. And they use a midrash in Sota on a verse from Psalms about something between the sheepfolds, right? And they would procreate, right? So, like, while the men were being oppressed by their labor, the women were able to see beyond this moment and to seduce their husbands. And that's what brought about redemption. I just want to say that midrash goes in other places, which is then, like, the Egyptians catch on, and it describes God swallowing the babies up in the earth when the Egyptians come to see them. And then this beautiful moment where they get to the Red Sea and the sea parts and they're walking through, and they say, right, they see God and they say, this is my God and I will exalt him, which is a line from the Song of the Sea from
Miriam.
I could find the exact thing from Miriam. Yeah. Or from just before Miriam's song.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
In Exodus. Ze'eli ve'anvehu. This is my God and I will exalt him. That the children recognize God because God brought them up. The midrash actually says, like a midwife would, or like a caretaker would.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, that was a bunch of midrash that I just dropped, so I'm going to be quiet for a minute.
No, that's totally fascinating, because when you first said through the, merit redemption through the hands of righteous women, I immediately thought of Shifra and Pua.
Shifra and Pua, absolutely.
Yes. And I was like, yeah, totally. And then you went in, like, this other, connected direction, but I was just like, whoa.
And elsewhere, the Midrash elevates Shifra and Pua too.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Right? That's the other thing about the Midrashic tradition is like, it's vast.
Yeah.
Like someone could tell me, you know, one of my colleagues could say like, oh, the Midrash says X, Y, and Z and make something up. And they probably could make it sound plausible because the tradition is so vast. But just to like come back to telling and retelling of narratives, right, that the Easter Vigil is doing, like it would be faithful to the classical Jewish tradition to tell that version of the redemption story at your Seder table. And that's a retelling, right, of a narrative that just brings more texture to this experience of acting as if we were coming out of Egypt, right? What role, if we're going to ask someone, what role would you have played in the redemption? What role do you want to play in the liberation story? And our only answers are from our Moses, the taskmasters, or whomever we read in the Bat Paro, who gets built up in the Midrash as well. This other retelling also says, oh, I want to be one of the kids who gets swallowed up in the earth and protected by God. Or I want to be one of the women seducing, right? Like I'm a powerful femme and going out and seducing my spouse so we can procreate, a little heteronormative, but I'm going to lean into it anyway, you know?
Well, and I could totally see the role of being the child swallowed up in the earth as suiting someone who's, say, neurodivergent and freaking out at a large crowd of people really well.
And they're just
beautiful.
Like, nope.
Yep.
I think there's like a gif of like Homer Simpson just being like swallowed up by the bush, by the like bush hedge behind him.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Can I share one more Midrash example before we move on?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
So there's a conversation, it feels related to Passover, but also transness. There's a conversation in the Mishnah. So an earlier recollection of Jewish law, not quite a code because it gives minority opinions, somewhere around 200 of the Common Era. And it's what the Talmud builds off of. So there's a part of the Mishnah that gets put into the Haggadah about saying the Shema or remembering the Exodus from Egypt at night. And there's a whole thing about that's because we're going to remember the Exodus from Egypt. I don't think any of this is relevant to where I'm going, but it is what it is.
That's okay.
We recognize it all the days of our life. And then the words here are kol yemei chayecha. Yemei chayecha, the days of our life. One person, Ben Zoma, says that means our days. And when you add the word kol, it comes to include the nights. And then the Chachamim, the sages, come back and say, Yemei chayecha, that's this world. And kol yemei chayecha, the world to come. So we're going to continue to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt, even in this idealized world, the world to come, Olam Haba, that we're building. Which, by the way, is an interesting thing. We're going to keep retelling this narrative. What is the reshaping of the Passover narrative when we're living in Olam Haba? I don't know. May we merit to get there one day, please God. But in that conversation, they bring up this fantastic verse from Isaiah 43, which is, do not remember the former events and do not ponder things of old. And this is, if someone's looking for it, in the Babylonian Talmud on Brachot 13a. You can find that on Sfaria or any number of Christian websites who have taken over the Talmud as their own, as happens. Nonetheless, it's there for you. We could talk about how icky that is, but it's there for you. So, you know.
Yeah.
For the record, dear listeners, that is icky. Don't do that.
Yeah. So the verse is, do not remember the former events and do not ponder things of old. And the claim that gets brought here that the rabbis say is, your name in Genesis, we get your name shall no longer be called Jacob, rather Israel will be your name. Right? And it says not that Jacob is uprooted from its place, but that Israel becomes primary and Jacob becomes secondary. Why? Do not remember the former events and do not ponder things of old. Right? Do not remember the former events. Don't hold on to Jacob. Don't ponder those days of old. Don't hold on to it, but rather focus on this new moment of your new name, Israel.
So shifting from like a nostalgic, which the Christian church is really way too steeped in, right? Like the nostalgia of yesteryear. And instead being like, no, here is who we are today. And what does that look like?
Exactly.
Yeah. That also feels super trans, right? Like, stop dead
and
naming.
They choose a name change moment.
Yeah, right. Stop dead naming. This is name.
That's right. Yeah. But also that doesn't go away, right? The shift isn't, that it doesn't go away. That Jacob still exists. It just becomes subsumed or secondary to or part of maybe even Israel, which I think is like a beautiful thing if we read Jacob expansively, not just as a name, but as who Israel is prior to this name change. and who trans folks are if they undertake a name change.
Yeah. So you've talked about some of your favorite midrashim, but I'm curious if there are any that you find particularly compelling or insightful that are not necessarily like your favorites, but like, how can you not? I don't know.
There's so many. I should just pick one. For you.
I mean, if you pick more than one, probably what's going to happen is one goes and one goes on Patreon or something.
Yes, that's generally how that works.
That's beautiful. Is this even a midrash? Wow, now I'm second guessing. I want to say, like, in terms of the way people's brains works, there are, you know this, right? There are pastors who like quote scripture like from the back of their hand, and those of us who don't. And I'm in like the oh gosh, I know thousands of midrashim, and what can I grasp?
Yeah.
Here's what I'll say: they're all my favorite. I don't know that I can separate favorite ones from insightful ones.
Okay.
But like, you know, I think there are midrashim that teach like why do places where we pray have to have a window?
Mm-hmm.
Right? And the answer is like so that the prayers that we have are like permeate out into the world, and so that the world out there permeates into our prayer life. And that feels like just like a really insightful thing around borders. There are all of these questions about, I'm not sure if this is technically midrash, but I don't know why it isn't. But there's a conversation about what time we should recite the evening Shema. And the conversation gives different paradigms for telling time. Is it when the priests go make their offering? Is it when the folks come in from the field? Is it when folks who are, this is the language of the Talmud, poor folks come in to take their meal? And just like whose time do we live on? And the insight that we have different times, I think is just like really beautiful. Those are two like insights that come out of Midrash that I think are really fundamental to broadening our understanding of human experience.
Yeah, I love that. Those are both making me then think of like all of these other connections in my life, which is part of Midrash.
So are there places, maybe online or maybe like accessible in a common library, where people can explore Midrash for free? And connected to that, are there any places you would say, oh, please no, don't go there?
Yeah, I love this question. And I would say, so Sefaria.
Yes.
Okay. Sefaria is like, I think one of the best places to find Jewish texts online and Midrash online. And not everything there is translated, but enough is to give you plenty to jump off of. Mm-hmm. And, you know, for general Jewish information, I'll just say like My Jewish Learning is my go-to. I feel like we're in a moment where it feels like not as fresh as it once was, but it is solid data without theology behind it.
Okay. Interesting.
In a way that like, yeah. I mean, there's theology behind it, but it's not, maybe it's just theology I don't find offensive. Maybe that's just the more honest. Maybe that's...
In the other podcast that I co-host, Horror Nerds at Church, we talk about anything can be horror, but also anything can be theology.
Yeah, so like, totally. And yeah. And then I would say like, you know, I try to avoid things like Aish or Chabad because they have a clear like sort of kiruv, which means a bringing closer agenda, which the agenda is, they have a theology that I think doesn't really respect everybody's autonomy and dignity. And so often they have beautiful insight and beautiful translations and actually bring texts in a really beautiful way. And there's a likelihood that someone's going to stumble on something that just like maybe does more harm than good to their heart.
Yeah. What is it with the incredibly conservative people that means that they also are the ones that make the very prettiest copies of scripture with the really nice journaling options and things like that? Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting. And I think in the Jewish world, it's really interesting. And I'm going to take a second anyway to uplift this because I feel like, you know, there's like this sense in the world that we're living in that folks like Chabad folks or Aish folks or observant or Haredi folks who are look Jewish in a different way, right? Who wear a different set of garb, etc., are often the targets of anti-Semitism in a different way. And so there's this part of me that like doesn't want to air our communal dirty laundry on the Nerds at Church podcast, right? To say that like I don't recommend their websites, but also to say like there are so many people, Chabad brings Judaism to places in the US and around the world where there aren't liberal shuls. And that I think is a beautiful thing. And for me, I think like were I to travel someplace where there wasn't a shul I feel comfortable going to and it was Shabbat, I might go to Chabad, even knowing the heteronormativity that's present and knowing that there's going to be a mechitza, separation between genders at davening. I might go anyway for that sense of home, and I would be welcomed without any questions. And so while I prefer folks not go to their website as like an intro to things, because I think it can be heteronormativity can be harmful if you're not prepared for it. I deeply appreciate the ability to get a Shabbat dinner in many, many places in the world because of their work. So,
yeah.
That sounds a lot like my relationship with the Catholic Church, actually.
Fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think last year for our Maundy Thursday episode, which is part of Holy Week, so right before Easter, we had an open Orthodox Jewish rabbi who I did clinical pastoral education with. And I had been to Shabbat with him like a couple times while we were in CPE. And yeah, there was like gender separation and these sorts of things. And also it was like the summer that New York passed marriage, and like, so we had all of these like really interesting and deep conversations. And also like, if I had been Jewish and trying to find like a shul, I would not have like ended up there. But the welcome that I felt within the context of like who I was and who they were, was really beautiful. Yeah. But complicated for sure.
And then are there any midrash or similar Jewish teachings that you especially would love for more Christians to know about, perhaps in such a way that we could be less frustrating to the Jewish community?
You know, I think the thing, I'll just uplift something from our conversation, maybe, which is that just opening like a culture of questions and a culture of like obscure questions and of boundary pushing questions is part of Jewish culture. Is part of like, is an authentic Jewish expression. And I think that's what I want to uplift, because it speaks to, I think, like a fundamental difference that like is around dogmatism that I think sometimes gets put back onto Judaism, right? Judaism like we have Jewish values. We'll argue about what those values are, right? On Twitter the other day, I said something like, if your Jewish values aren't rooted in lifting up the dignity of all people, they're not Jewish values. And people started arguing with me. And I was like, okay, fine. I can bring receipts.
Yeah.
Right? Like,
I saw that tweet.
That,
like,
that's fine. Like the Talmud teaches like that the kavod habriot, the honor of all of creation is enough to override prohibitions in the Torah. Like that's a big deal. Anyway, that conversation is just like part and parcel of who we are as people and how we approach cultural expression and religious expression and theology. And so like there's not a backwards mapping of like, what do Jews say about X? And I think that's where a lot of my own frustration with Christianity comes from, is this attempt sometimes to create something that doesn't exist, which is a definitive statement. Also, stop saying Judeo-Christian. But that's not about Christians, I think.
No, that's fair.
That's about Islamophobia, I believe.
Yeah.
That's what
Massively.
it is.
Yep.
Yeah. Don't say Judeo-Christian. Yeah, I think that's a really helpful thing, particularly because it is so easy for Christians to not know anything about other religions aside from, Jewish people believe in the Old Testament, which like we don't use Old Testament language really on this podcast because of how it is problematic. And so like our listeners will hear us say Hebrew scriptures, or sometimes we say the Tanakh, or like depending. And so it's helpful to have those spaces of like, no, actually, Judaism, in fact, is not one monolith. There are an abundance of different traditions and different denominations and like experiences and beliefs within Judaism. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so I'm going to go back real quick and then I'm going to go forward. But to go back, when you were talking about Aish and Chabad, and you were like, I don't want to like air our dirty laundry. And this is something that I, as a white person and a Christian, try to be careful about, right? Like, you get to do what you want to do. You get to say what you want to say. And I think you did a good job of like naming and also giving like a context. And it is 1,000,000% not my place as a Christian to then take that and run with it.
Sure.
Like, I can take it and be like, okay, if I don't want to, like, if I'm not in a place where I can hit up against heteronormativity like that, I'm not going to engage, and that's helpful information for me. But, like, it is not my role to be like, well, this group of Jewish people did this and this group did. So,
I appreciate that.
Yeah. That applies for all of our dear listeners and nerdlings and all of the other nicknames I'm trying to get started with our podcast fan base. So, dear nerdlings, don't explode other people's internal conflicts and discussions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I might be off base with this, but last time I checked, on the other hand, it totally is Christians' jobs to be the ones yelling at the Messianic Jews who are yelling at other people on the internet. Because Jewish people don't have to put up with that.
Yeah. That's
or shouldn't have to.
Well,
that's our job.
That feels like our...
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. I think the truth is that I think we all have to just be clear about what we're in a position to speak to, right? And where we're in relationship to be able to do that speaking. Yeah, it's messy.
It's true.
I say that at least in part because the only Messianic Jews I've experienced who yell at other people on the internet are the ones who, grew up Baptist in Texas. But
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, that feels like a particular
subgenre.
Yeah. But speaking of messy and complicated, is there anything else that you would really like Christians to know? Particularly, I know historically, I imagine it is still accurate to some level. I don't know how similar, but historically, during the Christian Holy Week was a time of increased anti-Semitism and increased hate crimes and stuff. And like the Gospel of John that people will have read probably on Good Friday is super complicated if you don't know the context and very easy to make into just this anti-Semitic horrible thing. Yeah. So is there anything you'd really like Christians to know, both in the context of like the Christian Holy Week, but also just kind of more broadly?
I mean, one thing to uplift is just that like the Gospel of John is what it is, and it's okay, right? Like, and to be able to look critically upon your own tradition and say like, oh, this is messed up. And that like, maybe that's something like supersessionism is icky. And also, if you're going to take anything from Judaism, this like culture of question and critical engagement from a place of love is a good place to start on texts that are difficult. I think the other thing is like, go learn something about Judaism.
Yeah.
Right. And like you all are doing that here. But I think that feels like Judaism gets dismissed or minimized because folks don't learn about it. And so don't know that there are still thriving Jewish communities in our own right out in the world. Yeah. And so we can all learn. I can continue to learn about thriving Jewish communities that I don't know about in the world, which I think does a lot to offset the ways in which Christian texts are dismissive of Judaism as a full tradition in its own right.
Yeah, sure. That's beautiful.
It is. As we jump into our readings for the Easter Vigil, I just want to point out that not all of the readings are required. For those who follow Vanderbilt's lectionary guidelines, at least 3 Hebrew Bible readings are required, with Exodus 14 always being included. For us as Lutherans, our hymnal would say that the Genesis 1 reading, Exodus 14, Isaiah 55, and Daniel 3 are, let's say, heavily encouraged with little special asterisks next to them.
No, they say really required in the hymnal. It says required in the hymnal.
Yeah, they might say required in the hymnal, but how many pastors do you know actually, always treat that as...
Oh, I don't always treat the hymnal, but for the Easter Vigil.
Yes, no, I know a lot of pastors who see the word required in the hymnal and say, okay, look, a challenge. So... And I happen to have known that you have occasionally been that, Pastor Emily.
Details. Yeah. Which is fascinating that then, Becky, when you brought up Exodus 14 as this, the Exodus story broadly, but that Exodus 14 is the one required text across the Easter Vigil. I was like,
it's hard to imagine skipping it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
So we have links to the scripture readings for you in our episode description, and our first reading that we start with today is Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 4a. The story of God's creation of the cosmos is told through a 7-day framework, with God proclaiming of each new creation that it is good.
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of intentional diversity, right? We get day and night and dusk and dawn, and we get like the various animals and plants and humanity, and we already have talked some about like God creating the divine human. So this last week, was the trans rights readathon, and so that was sparked by Sim Kern, who's a trans Jewish author in Texas. And so all of a sudden, like in doing that and following those, I got like a lot more of their TikToks. And they were talking about this white supremacist anti-Semitic trope that I had never thought about and realized, but that in so many of the like futuristic young adult dystopias that I love, like the Divergent series, they erase history. At some point, everyone's history has been erased and everybody is starting with like a clean slate and sorted into these other things. And what Sim Kern had like pointed out was that would never happen for Jewish people. Like Jewish people would never be a part of that reality because, and not just Jewish people, but they were talking from their particular perspective, right? But that like history is so much a part of the Jewish people that you can't get rid of that and have like it just doesn't work and doesn't compute. And I was like, oh, and this like connects with the Genesis one, right? Like that, yeah, you have to like to have the full diversity in a young adult dystopia, in some futuristic thing. You have to remember the history and you have to keep telling the stories that are connected to it.
Yeah. So in verse 3, we read, "Then God said, 'Let there be light,' and there was light." And one of my favorite ways that this gets sort of invoked, especially with visual media like TV or movies, is when the lights are turned on and suddenly we are shown what is surprisingly a gigantic warehouse that is filled with all kinds of amazing stuff that we can hardly imagine. And this just seems to keep coming up. Warehouse 13, The Librarians, National Treasure, Indiana Jones did it at least twice, I think, and a bunch of other places. And that's always really fun when the lights turn on and you get to see all of this incredible stuff. Or you see all of the boxes that the incredible stuff is packed in, at least.
Yeah, I like that. I was thinking about in verse 27, which we talked about a little bit, and the way that I had it translated is, "So God created humankind in their image. In the image of God, they created them. Male and female, God created them." And this has always been like my favorite merism, whether or not it was intended to be a merism.
Nice.
Right, the like naming of things that are supposedly like opposite ends of the spectrum in order to name everything in between. And so like when I'm reading this verse in worship or something, I actually read it, "So God created humankind in their image. In the image of God, they created them. Male and female, between and beyond, God created them." To give that sense, because Christians are like clueless about merisms. And so it gives that sense that like it is so much bigger and more expansive than these two things. Which I also just love that like trans people love verse 27 and like transphobes love verse 27 and we're all like, this is such a rich verse, or this is such a condemning verse, and it's like different ideas there.
And our response to this reading is Psalm 136, verses 1 through 9 and 23 through 26. God's steadfast love endures forever.
And then our second reading for this episode is Genesis chapter 7, verses 1 through 5 and 11 through 18, chapter 8, verses 6 through 18, and chapter 9, verses 8 through 13. Have we mentioned the people who created the Revised Common Lectionary had some problems? Trying to but God destroys all of humanity save one family and realizes it was a mistake, and hanging up God's bow, promises never to do it again. The rainbow remains a reminder for God of this. So I kept having this image as I was like reading the story of the flood. I kept having the image from Interstellar of in the spaceship that goes to like check the 3 potentially inhabitable planets. And just like it is the Ark. And I think they mention it in the movie at one point, but like it has like all of these frozen embryos from like all sorts of different parts of like the world and people and stuff to like propagate the human race on like some other planet if they can't figure out how to get humanity collectively off of Earth before it completely kills them. So I just like have this picture of like Anne Hathaway and the Ark, and
that's hilarious. Sorry. I love that.
I'm a fan of the like headcanon there.
Sure. Of course, not just the future of humanity, but also the future of, danger kitties and insects and eels and many other animals. Yes.
Yeah, I don't think the humans in Interstellar really cared about those creatures. It was just like a whole bunch of human embryos.
That's
one person who could give birth.
That does not sound like good advanced planning. Okay. As we jump into the verses, in chapter 7, verse 11a, we read, "In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 17th day of the month." And Rabbi Becky, I would be delighted if you would correct me on this, but I believe that this would not actually be February 17th that we're talking about.
I don't think so.
Right. So this would be according to the Jewish calendar, which I think would make it the 17th of ER. Which this
I believe you. I'd have to look that up.
Sure. Lands on May 8th in the secular calendar, which is when the rain that led to the flood started. And when I read this, I was reminded of one of our previous episodes with another rabbi who had commented that one of the very first things that the Jewish people as a people invented was their calendar. So. If you don't know what day it is, there's a lot of stuff you can't do. So that's fair.
That's true. Yeah.
Also really like systems to try and figure out not only our own calendar, but needing systems to verify the calendar. Like someone sees the new moon and they have to go before the Sanhedrin, the court, and testify to seeing the new moon to try and keep it sort of like
very like
on schedule.
Accurate. Sure.
On target.
And even today, like there's just to say there's tension there. Like Havdalah to end Shabbat is when 3 stars come out, or you can like go to hebcal.com and find out what time it is. And let me tell you that 3 stars is often earlier in my backyard than Hebcal says. So depending on the kind of day I'm having, I'm either going outside or I'm going by the time that I looked up before Shabbat.
Yeah. Or at what point do you have to get a telescope to make sure you're not accidentally counting the International Space Station?
Oh, good point.
Yeah.
And does Venus count?
Sure.
As a star, right? Because it's a planet.
Yeah.
I have had that conversation about like how do you calculate Shabbat with my CP partner, and so it's like yes, the 3 stars, and also like for a lot of Orthodox Judaism, it's we're gonna go the longest one just to cover all the bases.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then I was looking at chapter 7, verse 16, and it says, "And those that entered of all male and female of all flesh went in as God had commanded Noah, and the everlasting shut them in." And the question that came to mind to me as a child back in the day that my youth director brought up at my ordination during the children's sermon was, but where did all the poop go? That's a long time. That's a lot of poop. Just saying.
Nerds at church asking the important questions. Yep.
That's what we do. It's what we do.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Like, I don't know about Noah's Ark in particular or, how that was constructed, but I'm fairly certain that by the time we got around to, say, like the 17th century sailing ships, they had figured out a way to do that.
I think mostly
it
just
could explain it.
Involved shoveling it off the ship into the ocean, would be my guess.
Sure.
I don't know. I made that up. Asking the important questions and making up our own answers to them.
Yes.
Great. Yeah, and the response to that passage is Psalm 46. God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear.
Yeah.
I'm like fascinated by this idea of a reading and then a response, and the response being Psalms. And the one in the previous thing was that Psalm 136 is part of the Shabbat liturgy. And like, I understand why we would proclaim Hodu Ladonai Ki Tov, like this is good, over and over again in response to the creation story. And I think the thing about the flood and Psalm 46 is a match is like, actually God is the agent in all of this. right? So God is both creator of destruction in this moment, but then we acknowledge God as refuge.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a lot theologically.
Yeah.
Just trying to think about like what that experience was to immediately juxtapose God's promise not to flood anymore, and then God is our refuge is like just feels like a big trust. As someone with a high trust bar, it feels like a lot.
Yeah. Well, and for Lutherans in particular, Martin Luther wrote "A Mighty Fortress is Our God" based on Psalm 46. And so for me, my like go-to image for Psalm 46 is like a fortress, a castle, a like well defensible thing that can protect lots of people. But when it's paired with this reading of the flood, it's like, so was God the ark also?
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Like, is that the fortress that we're talking about? That the protection from God's own harm?
Yeah.
And I mean, but just thinking about then creation and what happens with the tohu vavohu being during creation, the unformed void, and the ways in which my teacher and my chavruta, my study partner, Rabbi Adina Allen, talks about that as the nothingness from which creation emerges. But also, like in my mind, creation becomes sort of like a sheet thread over these places that hold evil, but that all of it is part of God's world and how we understand God. But also, if we're going to try and understand God in human terms, there has to be forces of destruction, creation, good and evil, and everything in between those. Those are false binaries, right? Too.
Yeah.
Also, in the interest of full disclosure, I feel like I should point out that I came up with the summaries for the responses yesterday over the course of about an hour, and I'm pretty sure for the most part I just went with the most well-known line of whatever that was. So
fair enough.
Don't necessarily take the summary as like, well, I mean, most of it is Holy Scripture, but yeah, it's not complete. So our next reading is from Genesis chapter 22, verses 1 through 18. In a passage that we have always struggled to understand, God tests Abraham by making him believe he's going to have to sacrifice his son Isaac, before instead providing a ram to sacrifice and blessing Abraham for his obedience.
But this is the passage that I think about the most often when I think about Midrash, because as Kay said, we always struggle to understand it. Like, it is so difficult. And I've read some really great Midrash about like telling that story from Isaac's perspective. And like in the Quran, it's Ishmael who is Abraham's son. And like in this passage in verse 2, right, God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering. And like, I always wonder about Ishmael at this point. Like, is this like the oldest ignored child syndrome birth order thing of like, is there a Brady Bunch style Isaac, 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 instead of Marsha, 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 about like, hello, I am in fact not only your other child, but also the oldest one. And you are, and even God is completely like erasing Ishmael from this story. Lots of questions about this story.
Yeah. Also, just like questions of motivation, right? Our classic here, both from the sense of Midrashim that say God does only test those who can handle it, which I think creates a theology that's pretty horrible to live into, to other things, which like statements that are really interesting, I think, to take out of context of the Midrash. Like there's this Midrash in Breshit Rabbah, Shimon ben Yochai said, love upsets the natural order and hate upsets the natural order. And that in Hebrew it says, Vayashkem Avraham baboker. Abraham got up really early in the morning. And that phrase is used as a proof text to say that love upsets the natural order of things, that actually it wasn't Abraham's natural order to get up early in the morning and to do all this preparation work that he's going to do, that like Abraham had servants or like his society was structured differently, but he's acting out of love. And so that love upends the natural order of things.
Are you saying that there is scriptural precedent for getting up early not being the natural order of things, and no one told me about it until now?
That's definitely what I took away from that.
Indeed. There is also scriptural meaning for getting up in the middle of the night and singing praise to God. So in, King David. So,
as long as I can do that, sure.
That's right. They're all words of the living God, as the Talmud would say.
Yes,
Yeah.
but yes, thank you. And then jumping to verse 6, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the two of them walked on together. And 99 times out of 100, I am totally on board with have the grown-up carry the open flame and the knife. Like, that seems reasonable. Good choices. Don't have the child carry those. Very safety conscious. But the context of why Abraham might be holding those two things, because he wouldn't want Isaac to be holding them under the circumstances, makes this incredibly creepy. And B, also that would have had to have been, like, if he's literally taking all of the wood he's going to need up on top of the mountain, I don't know how old Isaac is supposed to be, but like the older he gets, the more it is, and that's a lot of wood. So they couldn't have like split some of that. I'm just saying.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah. So speaking of taking one verse out of context. And then the response to this is from Psalm 16, God is my chosen portion and my cup.
Which makes sense. I see the connection, I think.
Yeah, and there's more stuff in there too.
And then our next reading, which is the required of all required readings, is Exodus chapter 14, verses 10 through 31, and chapter 15, verses 20 to 21. God brings the Israelites safely and dryly through the Red Sea before flooding it again to kill the Egyptians. The prophet Miriam responds by leading the Israelites in a song of praise and thanksgiving. I just gotta say, I feel like Miriam, and maybe it's a Christian thing, I feel like Miriam always gets the short end of the stick. Like, she's literally called a prophet here, but gets like 2 small verses, and then most of Christianity like completely ignores her. And like when we do talk about the Exodus, it is Moses and maybe Aaron, and like hardly a mention of Miriam. And that just is sad.
Mm-hmm. But okay, I'm looking through the text and trying to see where you start and stop.
Oh.
In part because I'm thinking about a midrash that teaches just about like God being annoyed that people are singing at the drowning of the Egyptians.
Oh.
And the process of acknowledging Egyptian suffering during the Passover Seder by taking wine out of one's glass. But also it's fascinating. I'm not sure how I feel about like the Israelites' redemption being the central reading of the Easter Vigil. I'm having feelings, but I'm not sure what they are.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, like the central reading of the Easter Vigil is the gospel.
Okay, perfect. That's helpful.
Yeah. But
a helpful
like,
reminder.
In terms of the Hebrew scriptures.
Yeah.
That's the one required.
Yeah. And the 15, 20 to 21 is the Miriam song of praise. So it doesn't go into anything after that. And there's a like gap before that.
But it misses all of chapter 15, Az Yashir Moshe V'nei Yisrael, is Moses and the Israelites singing.
Yeah.
So in some way, I mean, that's interesting that it highlights Miriam singing and not chapter 15.
It does, but just wait.
Okay, I'm waiting. I see it now in your notes. I'm waiting.
Okay.
So in verse 18, we read, "And the Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord, when I have gained glory for myself over Pharaoh, his chariots, and his chariot drivers." And I notice that there is a group of God's beloved creatures in this list that was completely ignored, because this year, among my students who are middle school age, one of my students is the quintessential horse girl. She loves horses. She has a horse. Her mom has a horse. They all have horses together. And I am suddenly struck by wondering how her childhood Sunday school teacher would have told this story in such a way to not massively traumatize her for the rest of her life. Because, I mean, the Bible doesn't say that God didn't break the chariot horses' reins and let them run away with the Israelites, right? Like, the Israelites would have been, having a bunch of horses would have been really useful for them. That would have been very helpful of God. So, like, we're not saying that didn't happen, but...
We're also not saying it did.
Yeah.
Also, were they horses?
As opposed to...
I don't know, camels?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I suppose I was assuming horses, yeah. I suppose a chariot can be pulled by all sorts of animals.
Yeah.
They might have been donkeys. The Bible has a lovely history with donkeys.
Yeah. Also, I'm guessing that the Sunday school teacher just didn't mention that chariots typically are pulled by horses. Avoid as is.
Oh, now I'm having this lovely mental image of steampunk Egyptian chariots that like drive themselves, and I really like that. That's very fun. Okay, and also like should probably feature in the Muppet Bible musical somehow. So
probably, yeah. Yeah. I was looking at it, and I was looking at verse 22, where it says, the Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. And I was like, oh, it's like Moana. When like little toddler Moana and the water on the beach just like parts for her so she can follow the shells to get the heart of Te Fiti. And it's literally like, it looks like the Red Sea as depicted in like all of those many different iterations of the movies, some of which are great and some of which are awful, but like with the like fish just like hanging out there. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And now the response to the Exodus reading is Exodus 15 verses 1b through 13 and 17 through 18. Moses and the Israelites sing to God in gratitude for saving them from the Egyptians at the Red Sea.
He's out there.
Not totally avoided, but
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I've got nothing but irreverence, which is that the answer. The answer to Miriam and the women singing is all of the men singing back at them.
I mean, at least the women got to go first for once.
Yeah. And technically, they both get the last word and go first because we just like move the men to the... I don't know if I like that more or less or what, but yeah.
So our next reading is from Isaiah chapter 55, verses 1 through 11. The prophet Isaiah announces to the people that God invites all to God's abundant wisdom, leading to joy and prosperity.
So Kay and I both kind of looked at similar verses. I looked at verses 1 and 2, and it says, Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. And you that have no money, come buy and eat, come buy wine and milk without money and without price. And then I'll let Kay do the verse 2 part, but I just think that this is a fantastic argument in favor of expanding SNAP benefits, both in terms of the amount given, right? Like, come you without money, buy and eat, and in terms of the food that qualifies, because, okay, I'm going to skip and do it anyway, okay? It's eat what is good and delight yourselves in rich food. Just saying. SNAP benefits, Isaiah 55.
Absolutely. So I looked at the beginning of verse 2. Why do you spend your money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which does not satisfy? And I'm just going to say that this is another one of those examples of taking the Bible out of the Bible's context can be dangerous. Now, I am definitely the last person who would ever suggest going on a low or no carb diet unless you actually had some, medical reason for it, because I love carbs. I am a bread person. But please do spend a little money on other types of food too. Like, I realized that there are some fictional characters like Jester, the tiefling from Critical Role's second campaign that I'm currently working my way through very, very slowly. She can get away with surviving solely on pastries, which, that sounds like an excellent way to live your life until I start imagining what my digestive system would do to that. And so, she's also not human, and vegetables are good for you, and maybe you should have some, and also other things.
That's fair, I suppose. I am sitting here with...
Says the vegetarian.
A donut from Dunkin' Donuts, so...
Yeah, we are out of muffins because I ate them. So, the response to that passage is from Isaiah 12, verses 2 through 6. Surely God is my salvation. I will trust and not be afraid.
Indeed. Okay, I got it. Abundance. God's abundance.
I love this chapter of Proverbs, but I don't have anything more to say about it than I love this chapter of Proverbs.
Well, Proverbs... chapter 8, verses 1 through 8, and verses 19 through 21, and chapter 9, verses 4b through 6, because, again, the lectionary. God's wisdom personified as woman wisdom invites all to partake. And just as a note, some folks use Baruch 3, 9 through 15, and 3:32 through 4:4 as an alternate, but that's in the Apocrypha for us Christians, so we're not using it. Also, there's lots of readings. But yeah, this one... definitely had a like a woman wisdom inviting everyone to like come and take the red pill from the Matrix feel to me of like, come on, gain the wisdom.
Possibly the Oracle offering you a cookie while she did it. Speaking of carbs.
Yeah, that would work. Or a bit of Columbus.
Yeah. And then in verse 5 we read, O simple ones, learn prudence, acquire intelligence, you who lack it. And Acquiring intelligence might not be easy, but the first line of this verse of if you know that you're not very smart about something, you should be careful about it is definitely, generally speaking, a good rule. And it reminded me of the kids in the movie War Games. They knew fairly quickly that they weren't being very smart about playing the computer game, supposedly, called Global Thermonuclear Warfare. But since they thought it was a computer game, they didn't really think it mattered, and they didn't really care. Once they realized it wasn't just a computer game and it was actually, starting up nuclear silos, then they got much more careful. And then they managed to convince the computer that, as the movie says, the only winning move is not to play. But it took a while.
And the response to this passage is Psalm 19, the sun and God's law show forth God's glory.
Great. I want to say one thing about the readings, which is, I don't know if you've read Joy Layden's The Soul of the Stranger, reading God and Torah from a transgender perspective, but her opening is all about Jonah and really is I really recommend the entire book, but her opening is beautiful and brilliant. She's a trans woman. There's lots of history there. She's written a memoir and lots of poetry.
Yeah. Cool. Awesome. We'll find it on bookshop.org and link to it for folks. Yeah.
Great.
Okay. Our next reading is from Ezekiel chapter 36, verses 24 through 28. God promises to gather, cleanse, and give new life to all God's people.
So in verse 26, God says, "A new heart I will give you, and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove from your body the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh." And this definitely feels like the restoration of the heart of Tefiti, who became Tekah, this lava monster, deadly, scary, and then when she gets her heart back, it restores, and the lack of heart becomes this like soft, life-giving, nourishing greenness of delight.
Sure. Yes, I read the exact same verse, and I wanted to point out, please don't try to do surgery unless you actually know what you're doing. Again, God gets away with some things by virtue of being God. And the only reason that Dr. McCoy, who actually is a surgeon, gets away with, quote, performing surgery on a torpedo in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country, is that A, he did actually go to Starfleet Academy and would have had some basic training in circuitry there, because they insisted that everybody knows some basics about how their starship that they, lived on and could possibly die on worked.
That's smart.
And also, B, he was also, helping Spock, who was also there at the time, and Spock actually knew what he was doing. So, some things are important, and maybe you shouldn't try them if you don't know what you're doing. I'm just saying.
That makes sense to me.
And then the response for that reading is Psalm 42 and 43. As a deer longs for flowing streams, so I long for you, God.
Our next reading is from Ezekiel chapter 37, verses 1 through 14, which many of us just heard like a week or two ago. Ezekiel witnesses God bring flesh and new life to dry bones in a valley left from a battle long ago. And the overarching, the Valley of Dry Bones just feels so much like in the Hunger Games books when Katniss sees the meadow in District 12 after the bombing that had driven everyone out and killed so many people, and it's just this valley. I mean, they're not dry bones yet because it is still recent enough that it's people, but yeah, just like that utter desolation and defeat that it represents. And then in verse 7 we read, Ezekiel says, "So I prophesied as I had been commanded, and as I prophesied, suddenly there was a noise, a rattling, and the bones came together, bone to its bone. And I can't help it but think the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone's connected to the hip bone's connected to the backbone."
At least I hope so, or else you have some joint issues.
I used to love that song.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good one. And I read verse 10. I prophesied as God commanded me, and the breath came into them, and they lived and stood on their feet, a vast multitude. And it struck me that it's an awfully good thing that this is a vision, or else that would be a heck of a lot of shoes that Ezekiel would have to buy, for all those people. My goodness, I started trying to think of fictional characters who would be able to handle that, and I could see Cher from Clueless taking on the challenge, but it would still be a lot of work. And of course, knowing Cher, she would also insist on buying them all ski boots just in case they liked skiing.
That's very kind of her. And then the response for this passage is Psalm 143, For your name's sake, O God, preserve my life.
Our next reading is from Zephaniah chapter 3, verses 14 through 20. Zephaniah calls God's people to rejoice at their deliverance. And in verse 17, we read, The Lord your God is in your midst, a warrior who gives victory. God will rejoice over you with gladness. God will renew you in his love. God will exult over you with loud singing. And as I read this, I couldn't help but wonder, yes, but will it be good singing? Like, can
No.
God sing? Like, that whole thing about Jesus learning what it means to be human and having to adjust to weird things about the body. And, like, did Jesus ever get around to learning how to sing? Because we hear about Jesus doing lots of things, but I don't think we actually hear about him singing. We hear about people singing around him. And so, like, could Jesus carry a tune in a bucket? And if Jesus can't, does that mean that God can't either? And it reminded me of, apparently, Allison Hannigan, who played Willow on Buffy, was such a bad singer that during the
musical episode,
the musical episode, Once More with Feeling, she was actually supposed to be part of a duet with Tara. And she asked for the song to be turned into a solo for Tara because she can't carry a tune. She's not good at singing and she doesn't like to. And not everybody can. And so who's also going to, tell God that God has a bad singing voice? Like, that seems like an awkward conversation. So how would God know that God couldn't sing if no one was willing to tell God?
It's true. It's the emperor has no clothes, but God can't sing instead.
Yes. And, hopefully God would be fine with hearing that, but also, why would you tell God if God was actually being joyful about it?
Right? Yeah. When you read that and you were, talking about good singing, and I was like, does it matter? No!
I mean,
just joyful.
It doesn't
Make
matter,
a joyful
but also
noise.
If God is the one being loud, then that sounds like a lot of loudness. So
that's fair, I suppose. Yeah. And then I was reading in verse 18b, God says, I will remove disaster from you so that you will not bear reproach for it. And this definitely has major Frodo and Sam while the volcano explodes after having destroyed the ring energy to me. They're on the little rock and everything is falling apart and disaster is everywhere.
Surrounded
and then
lava.
They just get
the eagles are coming. The eagles are coming.
Picked up by the eagles. Yeah. They get removed from the disaster, I guess, instead of the disaster being removed from them. But similar concept.
I mean, even the eagles would have trouble carrying a volcano, especially if it was already on fire. So that's fair. And the response to that passage is from Psalm 98. Make a joyful noise to the Lord, all the earth.
The next reading is Jonah chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 2, verse 1. Jonah, chosen by God to call the people of Nineveh to repentance, instead runs the opposite direction and gets on a boat to Tarshish. God calls up a storm and Jonah throws himself overboard to save his shipmates and spends 3 days in the belly of a great sea creature before being vomited up on shore, reminding us that while God may save your life, you might not enjoy it much. It's just so true, so true. So one of the themes in this passage is the way that this passage reads, right, is this Jonah is this one person who is oblivious to the chaos and destruction that is going on all around him, to the extent that he's fast asleep, while everyone else is in panic and explosion and chaos feel. So I was this is kind of the combo of Quicksilver from X-Men when he's doing that thing where everybody else seems like they slow down because he's moving so fast, and just moving around while everything is bullets are flying and whatever. So a combination of that and then Deadpool's fourth wall breaking at home in the chaos of this accident in the beginning of the movie, and the pauses to look at the camera and say something. Yeah. That was the energy for that one.
Yeah, no, I absolutely see that. Yep. And then in verse 5a we read, Then the mariners were afraid, and each cried to his God. And I immediately flashed back to the movie The Mummy, when the character Benny was being followed by the mummy and was running away from it. And he kept trying out the various different religious amulets that he wore. He would know a phrase or an invocation for each one as he picked each one up and waved it at the mummy, and none of them seemed to work, and he kept getting more panicked as he was running away. And just sort of trying to find any god that would pay attention to him in that moment. And that kind of sounds like what the sailors are up to.
Yeah, that's the same feels. I got you there. And then when they do discover that it is, in fact, Jonah, who is the source of all of God's anger. In verse 14, they cry out to the everlasting, "Please, O everlasting, we pray, do not let us perish on account of this man's life. Do not make us guilty of innocent blood. For you, O everlasting, have done as it pleased you." And I love the story of Jonah in general because there's so much satire, right? Like the worst character is the prophet, and all of these who are supposed to be like not as good are so faithful and so compassionate to the extent that like they are doing what Jonah has told them they have to do, which is to throw Jonah overboard. And they feel so bad about it, and they feel such compassion for him, and they're like presuming that he's going to die. And it reminded me of Laia in the Ember in the Ashes series, because so much of her journey, like when she has her first kill, and it's a kill that is in self-defense because that person is trying to kill her, and yet there is just like so much grief and shock and lament at any killing, even when it's someone that like she believes has to die or when her life is threatened. There's still this like grief, and I love that there is this like compassion and grief for a stranger, even as they do this thing that they feel like they have to do to survive. Yeah. Also, like, what if they had just turned their boat and headed in the right direction?
I mean, did Jonah tell them what the right direction was?
No, but like...
Did Jonah tell them that the reason why God was angry was because he wasn't going the right direction?
Oh, like, no, that's true.
Jonah would have had to explain a lot to them in order for that to happen.
Yeah, that's true.
And instead, he just wanted to jump overboard, so...
You know, you do you, Jonah.
Yeah.
So the response for this is Jonah, chapter 2, verses 2 through 3, probably 4 through 6, maybe 4 through 6, and 7 through 9. So it might be all of 2 through 9, or 4 through 6 might be taken out. I called to God in my distress, who answered me.
And our next reading is from Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 through 4 and 9 through 11. The Spirit of God is upon Isaiah, who proclaims liberation and healing to God's people. And in verse 3a, we read, to provide for those who mourn in Zion, to give them a garland instead of ashes. Basically, God is giving hope and happiness to people who are mourning, essentially. Mm-hmm. And, of course, in the ancient biblical world, putting ashes on your head was a common way of showing others that you were currently in mourning. And now I'm flashing back, since we had literally just read the Jonah text, I'm flashing back to the part of Jonah where the city of Nineveh repents, and in order to show that, they put ashes not only on their heads, but also on the heads of their livestock, including, say, for example, chickens. And so now I have the mental image of God chasing chickens around to replace the ashes with garlands or lays or something, and I love that so much. And like, we need Muppets for this. Camilla needs to be here, I'm just saying. Camilla would love having garlands. That would be fabulous.
Yes. Also, the image that came to my head was Hey Hey from Moana.
Yes! Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
And that I think would have been fantastic.
Would of course have a lay. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Hey Hey and Camilla together. Oh, that would be so cute.
And God trying to cheer them up by giving them garlands. That's wonderful.
As I was reading in verse 11, we read, for as the earth brings forth its shoots, and as a garden causes what is sown in it to spring up, and this like image of new growth and new life, and I can't help but think of daffodils, which is my best friend's favorite flower.
Mine
and
too.
The like peeking up through the snow as the first signs of spring and new life. And this year, her daffodils got covered in like 6 inches of really heavy snow, and then it just snowed again yesterday. So
great.
I'm glad I sent her a pot of daffodils in that first snow, and that she had not yet planted them. But yeah, that like the peeking up of daffodils always is like just so cute, and such a like, you could totally make them Muppets too. Like,
yes, absolutely. And then the response to that passage is from Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 1 through 4, verse 7, verse 36a, and verse 43a. We love you, lectionary folks. For I will proclaim the name of the Lord and ascribe greatness to our God.
And then our final Hebrew scripture reading, which is one of the 4 required ones, is Daniel chapter 3, verses 1 through 29. In an over-the-top account, King Nebuchadnezzar demands worship from all the people, and when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse, the king throws them in the fiery furnace, where they survive and dance with a 4th figure. King Nebuchadnezzar partially realizes the error in his ways and demands everyone now worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So, just a note, the giant golden statues are not the giant chocolate Easter bunnies from VeggieTales.
I admit I'm missing some context because I did not really watch a lot of VeggieTales.
Much as we might
I do like the concept of giant chocolate Easter bunnies. Like, I'm on board for that part.
Yeah, they do a VeggieTales on this passage, and I'm pretty sure if my memory is right. If it's not, please, dear nerdlings, let me know. But instead of a golden statue, they have a giant chocolate Easter bunny Nebuchadnezzar.
Wow. Okay.
It's adorable.
And I think that eating that statue would be a perfectly appropriate response. I'm just saying.
Right? Yeah. Also, a PSA for everyone. As we talked about earlier in the episode, the fourth person in this passage is not Jesus. Jesus has not shown up.
No.
At all so far. No Jesus.
Yeah.
None.
Yeah.
No.
And then in verse 9 we read, "They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, 'O king, live forever.'" And, this could be a curse instead of praise that they're offering, because living forever and watching everyone you ever cared about die, I mean, that's not fun. Mm-hmm. Just ask the Doctor Who characters, Jack or Ashildr. They both had to deal with that.
Yeah. Jack. Mm-hmm. And then in verse 12, we read, someone is telling King Nebuchadnezzar, "There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These pay no heed to you, O king. They do not serve your gods, and they do not worship the golden statue that you have set up." Now, these three have already proven themselves to King Nebuchadnezzar. They, instead of eating what King Nebuchadnezzar wanted them to eat, they just had like raw veggies, and they did way better than everybody else. And so he's like, okay, and they were smart, and so he's like putting them in charge of things. And it just reminded me of like the misfit crew of the Rocinante in The Expanse. It's a group where like some are Belters, some are Earthers, all this. And they have proven themselves multiple times to the Belters, the Earthers, the Martians, and still the trust is like so fragile that like any excuse and that trust will just like fall apart for a lot of the first like season or two. Yeah. So, sometimes no matter how much trust you work to build up, it is not enough.
Yeah.
Or you just have to keep proving yourself. That's what happens with dictatorships. Because King Nebuchadnezzar.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And the response to this passage is the Song of the Three, verses 35 through 65, which I think is in the Apocrypha, but I think it's like the Song of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So, bless God, all you works of God.
Yes. And then our epistle reading for this episode is from Romans chapter 6, verses 3 through 11, which I believe we've also read very recently. "Through baptism, we are united to Christ in death, with the hope of being united also in the resurrection."
So one of the themes in this passage is the idea of death no longer having power. And it's the other version of when the commandant in the Ember and the Ashes series, who is very sadistic and horrible, particularly about torture, says, "There are worse things than death." This is the opposite of that. We're not talking like there are worse things than death as in like eternal torture type stuff, but like there are worse things than death, that death is not the end of all things.
Yes, death is not the worst possible ending.
Yeah.
Because it's not just death.
Yeah, because it's not the ending.
Yeah. And in verse 5 we read, "For if we have been united with Jesus in a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his." And this is true in this case for Christians, certainly. But you do want to be careful with assuming that if A, then B. And this made me think of the movie Frozen. They knew that the curse on Anna would be broken by true love, but they assumed that it would be romantic love and that it would be something done for her instead of something she did. Mm-hmm. And so that whole if A, then B thing, it works for this, and we work out why in great detail in the New Testament. In fact, a fair amount of the New Testament is dedicated to that, but be careful with those assumptions. They're tricky.
Indeed. And then our gospel reading for this episode, and for those of you who choose to read it on Easter Sunday morning, is John chapter 20, verses 1 through 18. Mary Magdalene, discovering Jesus' empty tomb, is somewhat believed by Peter and the disciple Jesus loved, who go look for themselves and then leave. Mary stays and has a conversation with two angels and then Jesus, who she at first mistakes for a gardener, until Jesus calls her by name.
Yeah. So in verse 2, we read, Then Mary ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Which immediately made the phrase body snatchers come to mind. And when it comes to the movie Invasion of the Body Snatchers, I immediately thought, a pod person Jesus, someone who has been replaced by a very similar but not quite right version of himself. That would explain a lot about certain parts of the modern church, wouldn't it? Like, pod person Jesus, that explains a lot of how various things have gotten twisted and messed with over the years. So
that reminds me of the meme of like the people who got upset about the changing the race of the Little Mermaid to what it probably actually was when it was written. And it shows like a picture of the woman who's playing her and the like Ariel version, the cartoon version. And then it says, "You're mad about this." And then below that, it has like a picture of presumably like what Jesus may have actually looked like in his time, and the like white Jesus with the sheep or something. And they're like, and yet, or it's like, you can't just change the race of the characters. And then it has that picture of like, and yet you've done it with Jesus. Yeah. But I was looking at this passage, and in verse 16, when Jesus says to her, Mary, and she turns to Jesus and says in Hebrew, Rabboni, which means teacher. And it just struck me as like the power of names and titles. And in the final Ember in the Ashes book, which I just finished last week, two of the main jinn characters are the Meherga, whose name means beloved, and Raymat, whose name means mercy. And the ways that like their names are titles and identity and destiny and all sorts of things, and like have such power and meaning to them, which I just loved.
And now for our friendliest, most inquisitive segment, let's make a Muppets musical. Rabbi Becky, do you have any Muppets or any people who you would like to cast with Muppets from our readings today?
I'm going to go with can I go back to my Passover theme and do a Hebrew? Okay, great. Yes. So I'm thinking about Bat Paro, Pharaoh's daughter, who entices Joseph. And I think I would love to cast her as Miss Piggy.
Ooh.
Yes, I could see that. Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, then is Kermit?
Oh, who is Kermit?
Right? That's the question. Like, is Kermit or is it not Kermit?
Yeah.
I don't know. I think maybe Kermit is Joseph.
Okay.
Oh, but also, oh my gosh, that rings with so much, because Joseph was once a not like the gayness of Joseph and Kermit and the rainbow connection. It's all coming together beautifully.
Yes, I love this. I love this.
Nice.
I feel like I would then put Elmo Benjamin and maybe Rolf as Judah, but like, especially a later Judah, has learned the lessons.
Oh yeah, cool.
Judah.
Yeah,
I can see it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm flashing back to the those without no money come and eat food without price. And of course, that's the Swedish chef who's feeding people. The Swedish chef is not in it for money. The Swedish chef just wants to, chase chickens around the kitchen and yell at vegetables until they jump in the pot like they're supposed to, and then feed it to people. So the Swedish chef does not care about money.
Mm-hmm. Nice. Mm-hmm. I like it. So, Rabbi Becky, any other thoughts on life, the universe, and everything?
That's such a great prompt. Life, the universe, and everything. Mm-hmm. The thing I want to do every day, all day, is to give folks of faith who have radical politics that revolve around creating a world that uplifts people's dignity, pep talks. Mm-hmm. That's what I really want to do with my life these days, and especially if they're trans.
Yeah.
And, so I think those are my closing thoughts, just to remind folks that the work that you are doing and the work that your listeners are doing in making our holy traditions something that feels relevant to our lives and allows us to live whatever we think of as our political ideals, our values. For me, to live the Torah is just such deep, holy work and radical work and resistance. Mm-hmm. And in the face of so much religion, and really in the face of so much violent Christianity. Yeah. Staking out space for a Christianity that is uplifting and about broadening whose can live in this world. It's just such a joy to get to participate in that project. So thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Has been great to have your insights and your wisdom and your own creative storytelling as part of this episode. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we'll discuss nerdery connections to the scripture readings for Easter Sunday. This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Roloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter and Facebook at Nerds at Church, or contact us at nerdsatchurch@gmail.com.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. If you want access to our uncut guest episodes and interviews, live Q&As, and more, support us on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdsatchurch. It's cheaper than getting together a horn, a pipe, a lyre, a trigon, a harp, a drum, and an entire musical ensemble to get people to worship you.
Absolutely. Also, let us know on Facebook or Twitter who you would cast for Let's Make a Muppets Musical for this episode.
As the ancient Christian said, Pax Vobiscum.